The Golden Oak Lounge was the kind of place where people went to be seen as much as they wanted to be heard. It was a Friday evening, and the air inside was thick with expensive perfume. The smell of aged leather and the low hum of confident conversation. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting a warm, golden glow over the patrons who sat at small round tables, sipping cocktails that cost more than most people's hourly wage. In the corner of the room, against a backdrop of dark velvet curtains, sat a grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, polished to a shine so deep it looked like a black pool of water. Behind the piano sat a young man with neatly styled hair and a crisp black suit. He was the hired entertainment for the night, a professional musician who knew exactly how to play without being annoying. He drifted through soft jazz tunes and popular classics, his fingers moving competently over the keys. He was good, technically speaking. He hit every note correctly, and his timing was perfect, but there was something safe about his playing. It was music designed to fill the silence, not to break it. It was the soundtrack to a business deal or a first date. It's pleasant and entirely forgettable. The crowd loved it, or at least they didn't mind it. They were too busy enjoying themselves to pay close attention. At a table near the center of the room, a group of 4 friends in their 30s was laughing loudly. They had clearly had a few drinks, and their inhibitions were lowering. One of the men, a loud fellow in a designer suit, was telling a story that had everyone in stitches. He slapped the table as he delivered the punchline, the sound cutting through the soft jazz coming from the corner. Just then, heavy oak doors at the front of the lounge opened. The chatter in the room didn't stop, but the flow of the evening seemed to hiccup for a split second. A woman walked in. She didn't look like she belonged in the Golden Oak Lounge. In fact, she looked like she had taken a wrong turn and ended up there by accident. She appeared to be in her late 70s, perhaps older. She wore a heavy gray wool coat that looked like it had seen better days. On her head was a knitted hat with a small faded flower on the side. Her shoes were practical lace-ups, the kind meant for walking on pavement, not dancing on polished floors. She stood just inside the doorway, clutching a worn leather purse to her chest with both hands. She looked around the room, her eyes squinting slightly behind thick glasses. The warmth of the room contrasted sharply with her appearance. She looked small and fragile against the backdrop of luxury and wealth. The pianist in the corner reached the end of his song. He let the final chord fade out gently and lifted his hands from the keys, taking a moment to stretch his fingers. He signaled to a waiter that he was taking a short break. The background music stopped, leaving only the hum of conversations and the clinking of ice cubes. The elderly woman seemed to hear the silence. She turned her head toward the piano, a slow look of recognition spreading across her face. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. She was moving with a purpose that surprised those who noticed her. She shuffled past the entrance, making her way toward the musician's corner. The group of loud friends noticed her first. The man in the designer suit nudged his friend, a woman with a sharp bob haircut, and nodded his head in the newcomer's direction. "Look at that," he said, his voice carrying slightly more than he intended. "Looks like Grandma lost her way to the bingo hall," the woman with the bob giggled, covering her mouth with her hand. "Oh, stop it," she whispered, though she was clearly amused. "She looks like she's looking for a coat check." The elderly woman didn't seem to hear them. She was focused entirely on the piano. She reached the small platform where the instrument sat. The pianist had just stood up and was taking a sip of water from a glass on top of the piano. He looked down, startled to see someone standing so close. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked politely, keeping his voice neutral. He was used to drunk patrons stumbling over to request songs, but this woman was sober. She just looked intense. She looked up at him, her face serious. "I would like to play," she said. Her voice was raspy, thin with age, but clear. The pianist blinked, confused. He glanced over at the bar, wondering if a manager was seeing this. "I'm sorry, we're not taking requests right now," he said, trying to be gentle. "I'm on a short break." "It is not a request," she said, her eyes locking onto the keys. "I want to play." By now, the tables nearby had picked up on the interaction. The laughter from the group in the center had died down, replaced by curious whispers. People love a spectacle, especially in a place where everyone is trying so hard to be sophisticated. The idea of a confused elderly lady demanding to play the grand piano was funny to them. It was a break in the routine. "Let's go on, let her play," someone shouted from the back of the room. It was a taunt, not an encouragement. "Give us a song." The loud man in the designer suit chimed in, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Free entertainment." A ripple of laughter went through the lounge. It wasn't cruel laughter exactly. It was the laughter of people who felt superior. They saw the woman as a joke, a character in a comedy sketch who didn't understand social norms. They thought she was going to bang her hands on the keys like a toddler or plink out a clumsy version of chopsticks. They were ready to film it on their phones or mock her to their friends later. The pianist looked at the woman, then at the crowd. He sighed internally. He didn't want a scene. If he refused her, she might make a fuss. If he let her play, she would hit a few wrong notes, people would laugh, and then she would get bored and leave. It seemed like the path of least resistance. "All right," the pianist said, forcing a smile. He stepped back from the bench and gestured toward it. "Just for a minute, okay? I have to get back to my set soon." The woman didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. She simply nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. She walked toward the bench. She moved slowly, her joints seeming to creak with every step. The crowd watched, entertained by the sight of her old coat and practical shoes approaching the gleaming, expensive instrument. She reached the bench and paused. The anticipation in the room grew. The man in the designer suit leaned in, whispering to his friends. $5 says she plays heart and soul, you're on," his friend whispered back. Grinning, the woman reached out and adjusted the bench. She didn't just sit on it. She moved it closer to the keys. She moved it with surprising care, lining herself up precisely. She ran her hand over the smooth wood of the piano, almost like she was petting a cat. Then she sat down. She was so small that her feet didn't quite reach the pedals, but she didn't seem to mind. She lifted her hands. They were wrinkled and spotted with age, the skin thin and papery. Her knuckles were swollen. Her fingers trembled slightly as she hovered them over the keys. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the first discordant note. The laughter in the room was bubbling just below the surface, ready to explode the moment she made a mistake. The pianist stood to the side, crossing his arms. He was already mentally composing the story he would tell his friends later about the crazy lady who tried to hijack his gig. The bartenders paused in their work, wiping glasses and watching the spectacle. The woman sat up straighter. For a moment, the confused look on her face vanished. Her shoulders went back, and her chin lifted. The trembling in her hands stopped instantly. She didn't look like a lost grandmother anymore. She looked like a general about to command an army. She lowered her fingers. The silence in the Golden Oak Lounge stretched out, heavy and expectant. Everyone was waiting for the joke to land. But the woman wasn't there to tell a joke. She was there to make music. She took a deep breath, and as her fingers made contact with the ivory keys, the world was about to shift on its axis. The laughter was about to die, but nobody in the room knew it yet. They only saw the old coat and the shaking hands, unaware that they were standing in the presence of greatness. The seconds ticked by painfully slow. The woman on the bench did not launch immediately into playing. Instead, she sat there, almost frozen, her hands hovering just inches above the keys. She moved her head slowly, looking down the length of the piano, as if she were inspecting a line of soldiers. She adjusted her position on the bench, sliding it just an inch to the left. Then, she moved it back. She seemed to be searching for a precise spot, specific angle that only she could feel. To the watching crowd, this delay was excruciating. The anticipation that had been building was starting to curdle into impatience. The group in the center of the room, the ones who had been laughing the loudest, began to exchange glances again. The man in the designer suit let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, checking his watch as if he had somewhere very important to be. Is she going to play, or just stare at it? He whispered to the woman next to him, making sure his voice was loud enough to carry to the nearby tables. I think she forgot the song already, his friends chuckled. It was a nervous kind of laughter now, the kind that happens when an awkward moment drags on too long. The atmosphere in the lounge was shifting. The initial amusement of seeing a crazy old lady approach the piano was wearing off, replaced by a collective desire for the moment to be over so they could get back to their drinks and their conversations. They wanted the punchline. They wanted it now. The pianist, standing off to the side, was shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He was regretting his decision to let her sit down. He had thought it would be a quick, funny diversion, a 30-second anecdote to add to his night. But this was dragging on. He worried that the management would see him letting a random guest hold up the show. He took a step forward, opening his mouth to gently suggest that maybe it was time for her to let the professionals handle the entertainment. But he stopped himself. There was something in the set of the woman's shoulders that made him pause. She flexed her fingers. It was a small movement, barely noticeable from a distance, but the pianist saw it. She stretched her hands wide, extending her arthritic fingers until the knuckles cracked. The sound was faint, a tiny pop in the noisy room, but to the musician, it sounded like a gun cocking. It wasn't the movement of an amateur. It was the ritual of a master. "Here we go," someone at the bar muttered. "Showtime." The woman took a deep breath. It was a ragged, wet sound, the kind of breath old lungs make when they are struggling for air. Her face, which had looked so confused and soft when she walked in, hardened. The skin around her eyes tightened. Her jaw set. She looked down at the keys, and for a split second, her eyes went blank. Staring through the piano to something no one else could see, the murmuring in the room began to rise again as people started to lose interest. A waiter near the back turned his head to serve a drink. The man in the designer suit turned back to his friend, ready to make another joke. The pianist looked at his own hands, then back at hers. Then it happened. Her hands dropped. They didn't fall clumsily. They struck the keys with a force that seemed impossible for a woman of her size. The sound that exploded from the piano wasn't a gentle plink or a tentative chord. It was a roar. It was a violent, crashing wave of sound that seemed to shake the dust from the ceiling. The grand piano, which had been a gentle background prop all night, suddenly woke up. The strings vibrated with a ferocity that made the floorboards hum. The reaction in the room was immediate and physical. Half the people jumped in their seats. The waiter nearly dropped the tray of glasses he was holding. The man in the designer suit choked on his sip of whiskey, his eyes widening in shock. The laughter didn't just fade. It was cut off as if by a knife. The woman didn't stop to check if everyone was listening. She didn't care about their reactions anymore. She was gone, lost in the music. Her left hand began to pound out a rhythm, a heavy, driving beat that marched like a soldier's step. Her right hand flew across the high keys, playing a melody so fast it sounded like rain hitting a tin roof. It wasn't jazz. It wasn't a pop song. It was classical. It was intense, complicated, and overwhelmingly difficult. The pianist stood frozen, his arms crossed but his muscles tense. He recognized the piece immediately. It was a complex sonata, one that required incredible strength in the fingers and a deep understanding of musical theory. He had played this piece in college, and even then, he had struggled with the tempo. He watched her hands, expecting her to falter, expecting the speed to be too much for her swollen joints. But she didn't falter. The contrast was mesmerizing. Here was this tiny woman in a faded wool coat, sitting on a high bench that was too big for her, playing with the power of a giant. Her face remained expressionless, almost stern, but her body was swaying slightly with the rhythm. She leaned into the instrument, attacking the keys as if they had personally wronged her. The silence that followed the initial shock was total. The loud man in the designer suit had forgotten his drink. He was staring at the piano, his mouth hanging slightly open. The woman with the sharp bob haircut had stopped smirking. She was leaning forward in her chair, her eyes glued to the woman's hands. Trying to comprehend what she was seeing, the music swelled. The woman hit a series of low notes that resonated in everyone's chests, followed by a cascade of high notes that sparkled like champagne bubbles. The complexity of the piece was undeniable. There were layers to the sound, a conversation between the deep bass and the light treble that demanded total attention. This wasn't background noise anymore. You couldn't talk over this. You couldn't ignore this. The pianist felt a strange sensation wash over him. It was a mix of shame and awe. He looked at his own polished shoes, then back at the woman. He realized with a sinking feeling that the way he had played earlier the safe, easy, pleasant music was nothing compared to this. This was raw emotion. This was a story being told without a single word. He realized that the crowd hadn't been laughing at a joke. They had been laughing at a ghost from the past, spirit that had wandered in to remind them what true art looked like. The piece shifted tempo. It slowed down, becoming dark and moody. The woman's touch lightened, caressing the keys now, rather than striking them. She played a soft, mournful melody that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. The mood in the lounge had transformed completely. The arrogance of the wealthy patrons had evaporated. They were no longer judges of a talent show. They were captives. They were being held hostage by the music, and none of them wanted to leave. People at the back of the room stood up, craning their necks to see the source of the sound. They couldn't believe that the little old lady they had seen shuffling in was capable of this. The waiter abandoned his tables entirely, standing near the wall with his arms crossed, completely mesmerized. The manager of the restaurant, a man who usually spent his evening scolding staff, walked out of the kitchen with a confused look on his face. He stopped dead when he heard the music, looking from the piano to the crowd, trying to figure out what had happened to his quiet. Upscale evening, the woman hit a particularly difficult run of notes, a ladder of sound that climbed higher and higher. The tension in the room grew with every note. Would she make it? Would her fingers cramp? She hit the peak perfectly, holding the highest note with a trembling vibrato that made the hairs on people's arms stand up. The man in the designer suit leaned over to his friend. But for the first time all night, he didn't have a sarcastic comment. He whispered, "What is that?" His voice sounded small, stripped of its usual arrogance. "I don't know," the friend whispered back, her eyes wide. "But she's incredible." Skepticism was gone, replaced by a dawning realization. They were witnessing something that money couldn't buy. You couldn't book this on an app? You couldn't hire this for a wedding. This was talent that had been forged over a lifetime of practice, a lifetime that nobody in the room knew anything about. The laughter felt like a distant memory now, a foolish mistake made by people who didn't know any better. The woman on the bench wasn't a joke. She was a force of nature. And as her fingers danced effortlessly over the keys, the only sound in the Golden Oak Lounge was the thunder of her own making. The sound that filled the Golden Oak Lounge was not just loud, it was aggressive. It didn't ask for permission to be heard. It demanded attention. The woman's hands were a blur of motion, a sight that defied the logic of the people watching her. Just moments ago, those same hands had struggled to adjust the bench and clutched a worn purse with a shaky grip. Now, they were weapons of precision. It was a complex piece of classical music, full of sharp twists and turns. The melody was frantic, jumping from the low, rumbling bass notes to the high, piercing treble. Her left hand was anchoring the rhythm, playing a steady, driving pulse that you could feel in your chest. It was like a heartbeat, strong and unrelenting. Her right hand was doing the impossible, flying up and down the scales with a speed that made the air around the piano shimmer. The pianist, the young man who had been playing polite jazz all evening, felt his jaw drop. He knew music. He had studied theory and technique for years. He knew that what she was playing was physically demanding. It required strength in the fingers that most people simply didn't have. He watched her knuckles. They were swollen and gnarled, bent by arthritis and age. Yet they didn't lock up. They didn't stiffen. They moved with a fluidity that was almost supernatural. It was as if the music was flowing through her. Bypassing the frailty of her body completely, he noticed something else too. It wasn't just about hitting the right notes. He could play the right notes. He could play the song perfectly from a sheet of paper. But she was playing with a depth of emotion that he had never mastered. When she played a soft section, she didn't just lower the volume. She made the piano sigh. It sounded like a person whispering a secret. When the music got loud and angry, she didn't just hit the keys harder. She seemed to attack them, pouring a lifetime of hidden feelings into the instrument. The piano was singing, and it was telling a story of sorrow, joy, and survival. The The crowd in the lounge had gone completely still. It wasn't just that they were listening, it was that they were afraid to move. The atmosphere had changed from a casual hangout spot to something resembling a cathedral. The man in the designer suit sat frozen, his glass of whiskey halfway to his lips. He had forgotten to swallow. He looked at the woman's back, then at his friends, and saw the same shock reflected on their faces. The smirk was gone. The arrogance had vanished in the center of the room. A young couple who had been arguing about their bill stopped fighting entirely. The woman turned her chair around to face the piano, her anger dissolving into fascination. She watched the elderly woman's posture. She saw how the woman's eyes were closed tight, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she were listening to a voice only she could hear. It was a look of pure transport. The woman wasn't in a restaurant anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere deep in her memory. The complexity of the piece was staggering. There were moments where the music seemed to clash, notes banging against each other in a chaotic storm, and then just as suddenly, they would resolve into a melody so beautiful it made people want to cry. It was an emotional roller coaster. One moment it was violent and scary, the next it was gentle and tender. The patrons realized they weren't just hearing a performance. They were witnessing an exorcism. The woman was pouring everything she had into those keys. A waiter who was carrying a tray of empty glasses stopped near the bar. He stood there for a long time, just listening. He wasn't a musician. He didn't know the difference between Beethoven and Bach, but he knew what he felt. He felt a shiver run down his spine. He looked at the other customers, the wealthy regulars who usually treated him like furniture, and saw that they were all looking at the same thing. For the first time all night, everyone in the room was equal. They were all just listeners, humbled by the magnitude of the sound. The music shifted again. It entered a passage that was incredibly fast, a flurry of notes that sounded like rain falling on a tin roof. The woman's right hand was moving so fast, it was just a blur. The pianist winced, knowing that at that speed one slip-up would ruin the whole thing. One missed note would break the spell. He held his own breath, waiting for the mistake. He waited for her to stumble, for her fingers to get tangled, but she didn't. She played with the confidence of a god. She was playing a piece that required a technique called crossing hands. Her left hand reached over to play the high notes, while her right hand dipped down to play the bass. It was a showy, difficult move, a visual spectacle that looked like a dance. Her arms crossed and uncrossed in front of her chest, the wool of her coat swaying with the movement. It was hypnotic to watch. The gracefulness of her arms contrasted sharply with the heaviness of her coat, the frailty of her face. The loud man in the designer suit finally put his drink down. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, completely entranced. He looked at his friend and whispered, "Do you hear that?" The friend nodded, unable to speak. They realized that the joke was on them. They had judged a book by its cover, and they had been proven wrong in the most spectacular way possible. They felt small. The woman on the bench, who they had looked down on as a confused nuisance, was towering over them. She had more power, more talent, and more soul in her little finger than they had in their entire, carefully curated lives. The music began to slow down. The frantic energy faded, replaced by a deep, resonant melody. It was heavy and sad. The woman's hands seemed to weigh 100 pounds each as she pressed into the keys, dragging the sound out of the piano. The notes hung in the air, vibrating against the walls. It was the kind of music that makes you think of things you've tried to forget. People in the room looked down at their tables. Some closed their eyes. The mood was no longer just impressive. It was heartbreaking. The pianist looked at the woman's feet. He had been wondering how she would reach the pedals. He saw now that she wasn't really using them. Her feet dangled above the pedals, swinging slightly. She was creating all that volume and all that expression just with her hands. It was a masterclass in touch. She knew exactly how hard to strike each note to get the sound she wanted. She didn't need the help of the pedals to sustain the tone. She was holding the notes with her fingers, controlling the decay with absolute precision as the song moved toward its final section. The intensity began to build again. The sorrow turned into determination. The notes became stronger, sharper. The woman's face, which had been relaxed in the sad parts, tightened up again. Her lips pressed together in a thin line. She was fighting a battle with the instrument, and she was winning. The sound grew louder and louder, filling every corner of the lounge. It drowned out the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. It drowned out the traffic outside. It was the only thing that existed in the world. The young couple who had been arguing reached, crossed the table, and held hands. They didn't know why, they just needed to. The music was reaching inside them and pulling emotions to the surface that they didn't know they had. It was a reminder that underneath the fancy clothes and the expensive drinks, everyone was human. Everyone felt pain and joy. The woman hit a series of chords that were like hammer blows. Bam, bam, bam. Each one landed with perfect timing. The piano shook. The chandelier seemed to flicker in time with the music. She was pushing the instrument to its limit, testing its boundaries. The professional pianist watched with a mix of envy and admiration. He knew he would never play this way. He played for money. She played for something else. She played because she had to. The piece was racing toward the end. The tempo was furious. Her hands were moving so fast, they looked like wings. The air in the room felt charged with electricity. Everyone was on the edge of their seat. It felt like the end of a movie, the climax of a story. They knew something big was coming. The woman took a deep breath, her chest heaving under her old coat. She lifted her hands high above the keyboard, preparing for the final run. The silence of the audience was absolute. They were no longer a crowd of strangers. They were a single entity, held together by the sound of one old woman and her piano. The final moments of the piece arrived not with a bang, but with a breathtaking sudden silence. The woman's hands, which had been moving like independent forces of nature just a second before, froze in the air above the keys. She held that pose for a fraction of a second, her fingers curved, her body leaning forward into the sound she had just created. Then she brought them down to rest on her knees. The very last chord was still ringing out, bouncing off the velvet curtains and the polished floors, filling every inch of the golden oak lounge. It was a heavy, resonant sound that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. The vibration could be felt in the furniture, in the glasses on the tables, and deep in the chests of the people watching. For what felt like a long time, nobody moved. The silence that followed the music was heavier than the silence before she started. Before, the silence had been full of skepticism and rude anticipation. Now, it was full of shock. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room realizes they have just witnessed something miraculous. Something that doesn't happen in ordinary life. The man in the designer suit sat with his mouth slightly open, his glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand. The smirk that had been painted on his face all evening had completely vanished. In its place was a look of utter confusion and humility. He looked at the woman, then at the pianist, and then back at the woman, as if he was trying to process the information his ears had just received. His brain couldn't connect the image of the frail, an elderly woman in the worn coat with the sound of a virtuoso master, at the table near the center. The young couple who had been arguing earlier were now holding hands tightly. They weren't looking at each other, though. They were staring at the piano. The music had stripped away their anger and replaced it with something else. They felt small, but in a good way. They realized that their petty problems didn't amount to much in the face of such raw, overwhelming talent. The woman had poured her soul into the instrument, and it had washed over them. Cleaning the slate of their evening, the pianist stood rooted to the spot near the curtain. He felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a tingle of jealousy, of course. He had spent years practicing scales and theory, trying to perfect his technique, and yet he knew he could never play with that kind of reckless abandon. He played it safe. He played what people wanted to hear. This woman played what she needed to play, and the difference was night and day. But more than the jealousy, he felt a profound sense of respect. He realized that he had been patronizing her, and he felt a hot flush of shame burn his cheeks. He had judged her by her coat and her age, and he had been dead wrong. Then, the spell broke. It started with a single person clapping. It was an older man sitting near the bar, a distinguished gentleman who probably remembered seeing great concerts in his youth. He brought his hands together in a slow, rhythmic clap. "Bravo," he whispered, and then he said it louder. "Bravo." Suddenly, the room erupted. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that usually followed the hired musician's safe jazz numbers. It was a roar. It was a wave of genuine appreciation that crashed through the lounge. People stood up from their tables. The man in the designer suit jumped to his feet, clapping his hands together with genuine enthusiasm. A huge smile finally breaking across his face. The waiter stopped serving drinks and joined in. The bartender leaned over the bar, clapping and shouting. The noise was deafening. It was the sound of people who had been collectively humbled, trying to give something back. They wanted to show her that they understood. They wanted to tell her that they were sorry for laughing, that they were sorry for underestimating her. They were apologizing with their applause. The woman on the bench, however, didn't seem to notice the thunderous reaction at first. She sat still for a moment, her shoulders slumping forward. The fierce energy that had possessed her during the performance seemed to drain away, leaving her looking small and tired again. She reached down with a trembling hand and smoothed the fabric of her coat as if she were checking to see if she was still presentable. Slowly, she turned around on the bench to look at the crowd. When she saw the standing ovation, her eyes went wide behind her thick glasses. She looked surprised, almost frightened by the noise and the attention. It was as if she had woken up from a deep sleep to find herself in the middle of a stadium. The transformation was startling. The commanding general, who had just conquered the piano, was gone, placed instantly by the shy. Confused grandmother who had walked in off the street, she offered a weak, hesitant smile to the room. It was a nervous smile, not a confident one. She didn't raise her hands in victory. She didn't bow. Instead, she just nodded slightly, a quick, jerky movement of her head. As if acknowledging a compliment she didn't feel she deserved, the pianist stepped forward, wanting to shake her hand, wanting to tell her how incredible she was. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He felt like he was in the presence of royalty. He settled for giving her a deep, respectful bow from the waist. When he looked up, she was looking at him with a kind expression, as if she knew what he was thinking. "Thank you," she whispered to him, her voice barely audible over the applause. She spoke to him like a colleague, not a fan. It was a simple exchange, but it meant the world to him. She hopped down from the bench, her feet hitting the floor with a heavy thud. She was much shorter standing up than she looked sitting down. She reached out to straighten the piano bench, an obsessive, habitual gesture. Smoothing out the velvet where she had been sitting, the crowd began to quiet down slightly, sensing that she was preparing to leave. They didn't want her to go. People were shouting requests now, begging her to play another song. "Play another one." The man in the designer suit yelled, "Please, just one more." "Don't go," shouted someone from the back. A few people even pulled out their wallets, holding out money, trying to tip her for a performance she hadn't even been hired to give. They wanted to compensate her, to pay for the privilege of hearing her play. They wanted to make it right, but the woman shook her head gently. She didn't look at the money. She didn't look at the people shouting. She just clutched her worn purse to her chest with both hands, creating a barrier between herself and the adulation. She seemed uncomfortable with the praise. It was clear that she hadn't played for applause. She hadn't played for money or attention. She had played because the music was inside her, and for a few glorious minutes, she had let it out. Now that it was out, she was done. She had nothing left to give. The energy that fueled the performance had left her exhausted. She looked weary, her frail frame seeming to shrink into the heavy wool coat. The pianist watched her, feeling a deep sense of sadness that the moment was over. He wanted to ask her where she had learned to play like that. He wanted to ask who she was. He wanted to know if she had been famous once, if she had played in grand concert halls before life got in the way. But looking at her retreating figure, shuffling slowly away from the piano, he realized that the mystery was part of the beauty. She turned and began to walk toward the exit. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. No one blocked her path. No one tried to stop her physically, despite their shouts for an encore. They stepped aside, watching her with a mixture of awe and reverence. It was a mark of respect. They let the queen walk through her castle. The man in the designer suit took a step forward as if to help her to the door, but he stopped himself, realizing that offering help might be insulting. She didn't need his help to walk. She didn't need anyone's help. She had proven that she was stronger than all of them. As she made her way across the room, the chatter was low and excited. People were whispering to each other, asking the same questions. Did you see her hands? Did you hear that ending? Who is she? The mood in the Golden Oak Lounge had been completely transformed. The air of snobbery was gone. The feeling of boredom was gone. The place felt alive, charged with the electricity of what had just happened. The music had stopped, but the echoes of it were still ringing in their hearts. The woman reached the heavy oak doors. She paused for just a second, her hand on the brass handle. She didn't look back at the piano. She didn't look back at the applauding crowd. She just pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. The cold air from outside rushed in for a moment, swirling around the room before the door clicked shut behind her. She was gone. But the room was not empty. The silence she left behind was not empty either. It was full of wonder. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the woman out and the silence in. For a few seconds, nobody in the Golden Oak Lounge moved. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see if she would come back in, perhaps to bow or to take a request. But the doors remained closed. The handle didn't turn. The night air had rushed in for a brief moment when she left, bringing with it the chill of the outside world, but now the warm, scented air of the lounge was settling back down. The man in the designer suit was the first to break the trance. He slowly lowered his hands, which had been poised in midair, ready to clap again. He looked at the empty doorway, then turned his head sharply toward the piano. The bench sat there, empty and slightly crooked, a silent witness to the miracle that had just occurred. The man let out a long, low whistle, a sound of pure disbelief. "I need to go outside," he said suddenly to his friends. He didn't wait for them to reply. He grabbed his phone from the table and stood up, knocking his chair back in his haste. He hurried toward the exit, his earlier swagger completely gone. He moved with a purpose now, driven by a sudden, desperate need to know who she was. He wasn't the only one. The young couple who had been holding hands stood up as well. They looked at each other, speaking volumes with their eyes, and then followed the man toward the door. The pianist, still standing near the velvet curtains, felt a pull in his chest. He realized he couldn't just go back to playing background music. Not yet. He needed to see if she was still there. He needed to at least ask her name. He walked quickly toward the entrance, passing tables of patrons who were still buzzing with excitement. When the doors opened, the cool night air hit them. The street outside was dimly lit, quiet compared to the warmth inside. They looked left, they looked right. The sidewalk was empty. There were no pedestrians in sight, no shuffling figure in a wool coat heading toward the bus stop. It was as if she had evaporated into the mist of the evening. The man in the suit ran a few steps down the street. Looking around the corner of the building, "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing against the brick walls. Wait, but there was no answer. The only sound was the distant hum of city traffic and the wind rustling the dry leaves near the gutter. She was gone. The group of them stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, shivering slightly in their expensive clothes, looking up and down the street. It felt impossible. How could someone move that fast? How could someone who played with that kind of power just disappear? It added to the mystery. It made the whole event feel like a shared hallucination, a ghost story they would tell for years to come. Dejected, the man in the suit turned and walked back inside, the warmth of the lounge offering little comfort. The crowd that had followed him out trickled back in, their faces stamped with confusion and wonder. The atmosphere in the room had changed permanently. The Golden Oak felt different now. It wasn't just a place for rich people to drink. It was a place where history had happened. People returned to their tables, but the conversations were not the same. No one was talking about business deals or stock prices. They were leaning in close to one another, whispering. "Did you see her hands?" one woman asked, her eyes wide. They looked so old, but they moved so fast. "I've been coming here for 5 years," said a man at the bar, "and I have never heard anything like that. Not even close." The bartender was polishing a glass with a rag, staring at the piano. He shook his head slowly. "She didn't even want a tip," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Just played and left." The pianist walked back to the piano. He felt a strange reluctance to sit down. The instrument looked different to him now. 10 minutes ago, it had been a tool of his trade, a means to a paycheck. Now, it looked sacred. The keys seemed to glow with a faint residue of the energy she had poured into them. He reached out and touched the ivory keys gently, almost afraid they would be hot to the touch. They were cool, of course, but he felt a shiver run up his arm anyway. He sat down on the bench. It was still adjusted to her height, too close for him. He slid it back, the metal squeaking slightly in the quiet room. He placed his fingers on the keys. The room went silent. Everyone looked at him. They were expecting him to play. They wanted him to try to recreate the magic. They wanted to hear that sound again. The pianist took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't play what she played. He didn't have that kind of fire in him. He wasn't a prodigy who had spent a lifetime mastering the classics against all odds. He was a jobbing musician. But he felt a new pressure, a new standard. He couldn't go back to playing the safe, boring jazz standards. Not tonight. Not after what they had all witnessed. He started to play. He chose a classical piece, something by Chopin. It was a song he knew well, a song he had played 100 times. But tonight, he played it differently. He tried to pour more feeling into it. He tried to attack the keys with a little more force, to dig deep into the emotions of the song. He closed his eyes, remembering the look on the woman's face. Fierce concentration, the total surrender to the music. It sounded good. It was professional and clean. But as the notes floated through the room, everyone knew the truth. It was good, but it wasn't her. It lacked the raw edge, the danger, the sheer life-or-death urgency of her performance. The woman hadn't been playing to entertain. She had been playing to survive. The pianist was playing to please. It was the difference between a photograph and a living, breathing person. The patrons listened respectfully. They didn't boo, and they didn't go back to ignoring him. They appreciated his effort, but the magic of the night was over. The lightning strike had passed, and now they were just waiting for the thunder to fade. The man in the designer suit sat back down, but he didn't pick up his whiskey. He just stared at the piano, a thoughtful expression on his face. The night had started out as a joke to him, a way to mock someone he thought was beneath him. It had ended up teaching him a lesson he hadn't asked for. He had looked into the face of true talent, and it had humbled him. Hours later, the lounge began to empty out. The Friday night crowd drifted away, heading to clubs or their expensive apartments. The pianist finished his set. He packed up his sheet music, unplugged the microphone, and put on his jacket. He was tired, but his mind was racing as he walked toward the door. He passed the table where the elderly woman had left her purse. He looked at the spot, even though he knew the purse was gone. He found himself wondering about her life. Where did she go? Was she walking home to a small apartment somewhere, alone? Did she have a family? Had she been a famous concert pianist in her youth, before time and arthritis took their toll? Or was she simply a woman who loved music, keeping her talent hidden inside her like a secret treasure, only letting it out when the mood struck? The manager of the lounge came out of the back office. He looked tired too, but he had a smile on his face. "That was quite a night," he said to the pianist. It was. The pianist agreed. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" The manager shrugged. "Who knows? People like that. They move to their own rhythm."
Out.
"I'm just glad I was here to hear it." The pianist stepped out into the cool night air. The city was quieter now. He walked to the train station, his hands deep in his pockets. He thought about the woman. He realized that she hadn't just played a song. She had left a gift. She had given the room a moment of pure beauty, reminder that there is more to life than money and status and appearances. He thought about how quickly people had judged her. He thought about how quickly he had judged her. It was a human reflex to look at the surface, the clothes, the age, the confusion, and assume you know the whole story. But tonight, the surface had been a lie. The truth was hidden inside. It's waiting for the right moment to come out. The pianist reached the subway station and swiped his card. As he stood on the platform waiting for the train, he could still hear the music in his head. It wasn't the sound of his own playing. It was the sound of her hands. It was the sound of the laughter dying out and the truth taking over. It was a sound he knew he would never forget. The train pulled into the station with a screech of metal on metal, a harsh, modern noise. But as the doors opened, the pianist smiled. He carried a secret melody in his heart that was louder than the city noise. And he knew, in a way he hadn't known before, that beauty often shows up where you least expect it, if only you are quiet enough to listen.